Hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking about another book because I am still not done with Oliver Twist. It's been a long journey with that book and I'm hoping to get it done by next week so I can review it for you guys next Wednesday. But I figured why not delve back a little bit into my past and review a book that I've already read. And this book has been a while since I have read this book, but I do really remember a lot of significant parts to it. So I think it's more than fair to say that I could give you sort of a synopsis about it. But basically that book is called Helen of Troy, and it is by Margaret George. And she writes basically historical fiction novels, and she sort of bases it upon a person. You'll see this in her memoir, the Memoirs of Cleopatra novel. You'll see this in the Henry VIII novel. You'll also see this in her Mary Magdalene novel. She does a ton of novels that just basically focus a lot on really one person and the people that surround basically that person's life. Meaning that this book, and yes, this book, is going to be told through Helen's perspective, as are the other ones that are told respectively by Cleopatra, Henry VIII, Mary Magdalene, and so on. They're all told within that person's perspective. And you kind of see how she has a sort of certain way of telling a story. In particular, since a lot of her novels dive into a past that has maybe a different culture than the culture that we have today, you'll probably notice if you choose to read the novel that there is a lot of somewhat historical and sometimes almost mythical perspectives. In particular with this novel, Helen of Troy does sort of know about the gods, and in this book world, these gods happen to exist. And what gods, you might be wondering what I'm talking about? Well, I'm talking about Aphrodite, I am talking about what's her name? Athena, god of war, or goddess of war, because she's female, and some other gods, I think, as well. But I think it mainly focuses on those two. And again, you'll kind of see how they play into sort of the novel as it progresses. But for the most part, what I can say is that there is a lot of mythical-esque type stuff within this novel. And in particular, Helen, we don't even really know if this person really existed. It's somewhat, I think, controversial within the community as to exactly her story, and exactly what happened to her, or any of those things. We don't really know, because again, she is a very mythical-like creature, or mythical-like person. I almost said creature there, but she almost is kind of like, I guess you could qualify her as an interesting character, making her sort of a creature. But anyway, getting back to the point though, what I wanted to say is basically that the author's trying to set up sort of this mythical-like world within every sort of setting that she puts in. I'm not sure if she does this with all of her novels. I haven't read all of her novels. In particular, Cleopatra one, I think she doesn't really touch so much on like the gods or goddesses really being there. But here it's really touched on, and you really do see how they kind of play a little bit of a role, and how it sort of follows a little bit of what happens in the Iliad at times. And it sort of portrays characters in a sort of a similar way like the Iliad does. In particular with Achilles, because in the Iliad he's a pretty crazy type-ish killing machine. There's just no way to get behind that, and I read the Iliad, and yeah. And in this novel it's sort of the same thing. Now this novel, since it is told from Helen of Troy's perspective, or Helen, however you want to call her, since it's told from her perspective, you'll probably understand that it is going to try to paint her as sort of our protagonist here, or our main character. And she is, because, again, it is told through her voice, and you do see all of the different struggles that she goes through. And you sort of see her flaws as well as her virtues. And this is actually really it's sometimes very graphic in the way it explains certain things. In particular, the war of the book. Now, I know that this, I usually think that people who would click on a Helen of Troy video would at least kind of know what Helen of Troy is. But in case you don't know, I'm just going to back up here real quick and just explain a little bit of the plot here. Okay, in this particular book, it basically follows her life from early on to all the way to when she's really old. And basically, within that, we get really these major things that have been put into sort of mythical-like tales. You'll see the basically the Trojan War that happens, and how she ends up going with Paris, and basically Paris is is a Trojan, and Helen is from Sparta. They fall in love, their love's forbidden, and they go away together. The king from Sparta gets mad, starts war with Troy because Paris is from Troy, and he thinks that he can somehow get Helen back by starting a war. And again, I think the sort of mythical stuff that surrounds this, in particular with Helen's character, I think the whole point, I think, is just to try to get the reader invested in her, because again, it is told through her perspective, but not just her, but her surroundings as well, because this is a very visual book. I think this book really tries to paint this kind of world. I think it does try to dive into the certain things that you would maybe see in ancient times, which is basically what Helen of Troy is. It is in ancient Mediterranean Greek times. So this is before Romans, this is Greeks. For Romans, there were the Greeks, and the Greeks were really the main power through a lot of the Mediterranean, and they even fought against each other. And I like how in the beginning it offers a map, and basically you can actually follow the journey that she made with Paris, which I find kind of funny. And it says like Helen's, or I probably can't show it to you here, but it says Helen and Paris's journey from Sparta to Troy, and basically Troy's all the way up here. If you can somehow see, I'm gonna try to see if I can. Yes, it's like in that box right up there, and then Sparta, I believe, is all the way down there. So basically it's a really long journey all the way up to where the square is, or I guess rectangle, where Troy is located. And basically Troy is a big power center, and is really a big challenge to a lot of the other Greek islands. And basically what ends up happening, since all of these Greek powers are sort of separate, they all kind of come together to go against Troy, because they see Troy as sort of maybe a power threat. And I think that the novel tries to sort of emphasize the fact that it's really not about Helen. A lot of people misinterpret, I think, the idea that somebody would start a war just because of the fact that he can't hold on to a woman. I really think that this novel was trying to paint it as such that it was an excuse. Like her running away with Paris was sort of, I think, an excuse, ultimately. And not necessarily the main reason why all of the Greeks decided to go to war. And you have to understand that Menelaus, the one that she's originally married to, who is like the king of Sparta, he has a brother, and basically this brother is the one that's kind of the power-hungry guy who, you know, really wants power. I mean, he doesn't really want to go to war just because of that. But everybody seems to know, I think, that Troy is a really, you know, a really big place, and a very significant place at that. And what better way to start a war by having an excuse? And they kind of use Helen's story and her decision making as a means of excuse to start war with Troy, basically. And you'll kind of see this sort of play out in how she tells it through her perspective, for the most part. Now, what I also say is that this novel is rather sad. It kind of paints Helen's relationship with Paris as more of a tragedy. I think some people don't really find, in particular, Helen and Paris as a couple to be likable, because they did make decisions that ultimately somehow led to the war. But I personally feel, as someone who me being, I guess, a rational person, and me being somebody who just takes a step back and goes, would they really start a war just because of that? Or are there really some other implications here? And I think the novel tries to paint that there's other implications involved. However, those implications are not really fully explored, because, again, this is told through Helen's perspective. But I think they are there. In particular with her, Menelaus, her real actual husband's brother. And you do end up, I think, liking Helen and Paris in this book. Usually the way that other interpretations depict them is not really, I think, on the most likable ends, because of the problems that they end up causing. But I think this one tries to play into sort of the tragedy of it. Sort of similar to a little bit like Romeo and Juliet. And you'll kind of see how really sometimes people's flaws really end up destroying other parts and aspects of their lives, and how sometimes decisions aren't always clear cut, and no matter what you choose, ultimately there is consequences. I think that the book really does try to hammer that point into our brain, that even though she does make sometimes questionable decisions, sometimes those questionable decisions ultimately still have repercussions no matter what she chooses. And you kind of see how even at one point her and Paris's relationship is sort of tested, and you kind of see that play out. And at points she does feel really guilty. I think they do try to make her as likable as possibly a Helen character could be. by giving her as many dimensions as they can, because again, this is a really big book and it's all her 24/7, all her perspective, all her voice. And for the most part, I think they do well in trying to paint this as sort of a kind of Romeo and Juliet type tragedy, while at the same time providing a lot of interesting things to go along with it, and with the characters that she encounters and how she goes from one place to the next, and how her relationship with Paris progresses, and how the relationship ends up affecting all the other characters as well. And it's just very detailed, and a lot of people found it to be very, very appealing. And it is a New York Times bestseller. This is a New York Times bestseller. And a lot of people, I think, really seemed to like it and enjoy it. But again, it probably depends on if you find, I think, at least from what I think, what maybe might not interest some people is maybe the fact that it does try to shroud actual history with these kinds of mythical things happening. But since it's told through her perspective, I think that's maybe understandable, because people in those times periods really did believe in these kinds of gods. They did believe in all of these kinds of mythical people that really were gods. And you kind of see how even Helen herself is somehow related to something sort of mythical, and how that plays into the novel, sort of towards the beginning, and sometimes that stuff I find to be very interesting. However, there's that history, rational side part of my brain that kind of says to myself, okay, this would not happen. No. The most, probably, I even think, Troy, the actual movie, is probably the most, maybe one of the most realistic type adaptations I've seen of the Troy legend, or the Trojan War sort of legend. And that's saying something, because the Iliad encompasses the same thing as this book does with the gods and goddesses, and the same here. So it's whether or not you are more of a rational person who just kind of goes, I don't know if I want these kinds of mythical type things happening. But they do, but they don't really happen so often. I don't think the book tries to force it down your throat, but it does try to emphasize the point that they are there. But basically, that's really a gist of a lot of what this novel encompasses. For the most part, what I can say about sort of this kind of biopic telling of Helen's life is sort of like how you would probably see someone who lived maybe in that time period, because in that time period there was just a lot of different rules and customs, and you sort of had to follow the idea of being really married at a young age, and having to go along with what everybody else wants you to do, and maybe even having children at a fairly young age. And you kind of see how these things sort of weigh in onto her character as the story goes on. And for the most part, it does play out sort of like a tragedy. It's not intended to be very whimsical and happy. It's very it's very sad at times. it also has very graphic stuff that I mentioned earlier, and those graphic things that I mentioned is that you will picture things when you read this book, and sometimes those things are kind of more bloody and graphic because, again, we have a war going on here, and one of the characters gets their head chopped off, and you'll hear about that once you choose to read it. There's still a lot of violence in it, and I think she tries to show that violence there, and how it ultimately sort of affects Helen's character. And it really does try to, I think, make us more side with the Trojans ultimately than the Greeks, because again, Helen sort of paints Achilles as this like really crazy, because he is rather young, so he's sort of like a teen or a kid, and he's really crazy in this book. But she paints him like that because, I mean, that's how she would see him, and I think that sort of makes sense. Similar to if you would see such a movie like Amadeus, and how they portray Mozart as very over, I guess you could say eccentric, and how he laughs really loudly, and even though he's probably not really like that, but a certain character may see him that way. And since it's told through Helen's perspective, you would probably understand why Achilles is portrayed in such way. It's because, again, it's through her perspective. So that's really, I think, what you have to understand for the most part. However, I do like how they make Menelaus' character, her actual husband, how they do make him sort of layered, and they don't really make him as such a bad guy. But again, that's because Helen really knows him and has been able to develop some sort of relationship with him. And you kind of see that he does have more dimensions. Unlike somebody like Achilles, where she's only encountered maybe a couple of times, and she sees like just how crazy he is. And I mean, I guess that's really all you have to understand. And some people may prefer that it's not told through a person's perspective because we might get a sense more of the different characters. But if you're looking for something that's told within a particular character's perspective, and a character that is pretty much shrouded in mystery and mythology, that we don't really know much about her, but I like how even though we don't know a whole that much, the author was still able to come up with a pretty thick book. So if you really want a nice, good summer read, I remember reading this over the summer a couple of years back, and I still remember really big chunks of it, and it's just been, like, I think, imprinted upon my brain, because I kind of find the story fascinating. I find the whole concept of the Trojan War to be very interesting. I really like Greek history. I'm part Greek, so I guess that's why I find it appealing. But basically, all that I've told you is really all you kind of really need to know if this is something that would be up your alley. It's really trying to sort of encapsulate us into a different world in a different time, and is trying to paint Helen as the center of this kind of world. And in this world, I mean this ancient Greek type-ish world. But I think that's really all I can say. Any comments, questions, concerns, more than happy to answer them. And until next time, bye-bye, everybody.